Some men live by the rules, others write their own. And then there's Dayne Brajkovich. In the dark underworld of Perth, where power is taken, not given, one name was feared above all: Dayne Brajkovich, the towering, tattooed enforcer of the Hells Angels. A man who climbed to the top of one of the world's most dangerous outlaw motorcycle gangs. But when you live by the sword, you either rule the battlefield or die on it. And in December 2023, at a concert packed with 10,000 people.
In December 2023, chaos erupted at a Ministry of Sound concert in Perth, Australia.
A blade came for his throat. The attack was swift, precise, nearly perfect. Nearly. The man who had spent his life dishing out violence now found himself on the receiving end. Blood gushed from his neck. Panic erupted in the crowd, and somewhere in the chaos, the man who had tried to kill him disappeared into the night. But here's the thing about Dayne Brajkovich. He's not easy to kill. Survival is in his DNA. He's been doing it his whole life. From a brutal childhood in the slums of Western Australia to the high ranks of the most notorious bikie club in the world, this is the story of a man who had it all: power, fear, respect, until he lost everything. Now the only question left is, who wanted him dead? And maybe the better question is, who didn't? Dayne Brajkovich wasn't born a king. He was made in the fire of Perth's toughest streets. Born in 1979, he grew up in the crime-riddled suburbs of Western Australia's capital, a place where the weak were swallowed whole and the strong learned to fight back. His father, a man he despised. School, a place that kicked him out before he even had a chance. The streets were his real teachers, and what they taught him was simple: if you want something, take it. If someone stands in your way, remove them. And Dayne, he was a fast learner. By his teenage years, he wasn't just running with the wrong crowd, he was leading them. Among his closest influences, Tristan Albury, one of Australia's most feared psychopaths. Albury didn't just break laws, he broke people. And Dayne was taking notes. But while most young men wasted their days chasing cheap thrills, Dayne had his eyes on something bigger. The Hells Angels, a name whispered in fear, a club where loyalty was paid for in blood and brutality. Dayne didn't just want in, he wanted to own it. But the Hells Angels don't just let anyone in. You don't fill out an application. You don't get an invitation. You prove yourself. Most men break before they ever reach the top. Dayne Brajkovich wasn't most men. At 6'2" and 220 pounds, he already had the physical presence of a warrior. But it wasn't just about size. It was about violence, loyalty, and the willingness to do what others wouldn't. And Dayne, he had no limits. He was ruthless, relentless, and most of all, loyal. By the time he was 26, he had done what many bikies never lived long enough to achieve. He became Sergeant-at-Arms of the Hells Angels Perth chapter, one of the highest-ranking enforcers in the club. His job, keep the club in line, handle threats, crush enemies. He didn't just enforce rules, he was the rule. He built a reputation as a man who didn't forgive, didn't forget, and never backed down. Under his rule, the Hells Angels' power in Perth exploded. Their influence stretched into every corner of the underworld. Drugs, weapons, intimidation. But in this world, power is a dangerous thing, because when you have it, everyone wants to take it from you. For years, Dayne had been the iron fist of the Hells Angels. But power never lasts forever. As the club grew, so did the tensions behind closed doors. Dayne had a strict code, loyalty to the club above everything. But others, they were fraternizing with rival gangs. Hells Angels partying with the rebels, the gypsy jokers. To Dayne, this wasn't just disrespect. It was betrayal. He voiced his anger, made his stance clear, and then he made the biggest mistake of his life. He challenged the wrong people. Senior members of the club, including Perth president Nick Martin, weren't happy with Dayne's outbursts. Arguments turned into shouting matches. Shouting matches turned into threats. And then, one day at the clubhouse, violence erupted. Nick Martin landed one punch, and just like that, it was over. Dayne Brajkovich, the man who once ruled with an iron grip, was expelled from the Hells Angels. Just like that. Everything he built, everything he fought for, gone. And if you know anything about outlaw motorcycle gangs, you know one thing for sure. Once you're out, you're a dead man walking. Expulsion from the Hells Angels isn't just a loss of membership. It's a death sentence. Your brothers become your executioners. Dan had spent his life handing out justice. Now, he was the one waiting for it. With no club backing him, no protection, and a target on his back, he tried to rebuild his life. He shifted into property management, making money the legal way. But old habits die hard. The police weren't done with him. Dayne Brajkovich had spent years making people fear him. But in December 2023, fear finally came for him. It was a concert night in Perth. A packed crowd of 10,000 people, bodies moving to the rhythm of the music. Among them was Brajkovich, tattooed, gold-draped, and impossible to miss. He might not have been a Hells Angel anymore, but he still carried himself like a king. At 9:50 p.m., the moment came. A sudden movement in the crowd, a flash of steel in the light, and then pain. A razor-sharp blade slashed across his throat, missing his jugular by mere millimeters. Blood poured down his chest, soaking into his clothes, and for the first time in his life, Brajkovich felt it. Helplessness. The crowd exploded in panic. People pushed and screamed, not knowing whether they were running from a fight or from something far worse. His attacker, gone. Vanished into the night. He should have died right there, bleeding out on the ground. But fate had other plans. A doctor happened to be in the crowd, rushing forward just in time, pressing against the wound, keeping him alive until paramedics arrived. That blade had come inches from ending him, but it didn't. And now, Brajkovich had one question burning in his mind. Who wanted him dead? Maybe a better question was, who didn't? The cops didn't buy the idea that this was random. No one did. Within days, raids swept through Perth, targeting Hells Angels clubhouses, biker hangouts, and anyone with a link to the attack. 5 people were arrested. Guns, drugs, and ammunition were seized. But the one thing police needed most, the name of the attacker, remained missing. Detective Senior Sergeant Anthony Thompson confirmed what everyone already suspected. This wasn't just a fight. This wasn't some drunken altercation gone too far. This was a hit. At this stage, we believe the incident is a result of an in-house gang-related issue between the Hells Angels and a former member, he told the media. A former member. That phrase hung heavy in the air because everyone already knew who they were talking about. Dayne Brajkovich. But if this was the Hells Angels' revenge, the message wasn't just meant for him. It was meant for every other outlaw who thought they could walk away from the life. You don't just leave the Hells Angels. You get buried by them. If you knew anything about the Perth underworld, you knew this attack wasn't happening in a vacuum. It wasn't just about Dan's expulsion from the Hells Angels. This was bigger. It all went back to November 2020, when Nick Martin, the Rebels' bikie kingpin and Perth's Hells Angels president, got into a bar fight. The man who beat him that night, Dayne Brajkovich. It wasn't just a fight. It was a beatdown. Surveillance footage showed Dan unleashing a brutal flurry of punches, knocking Martin down in front of everyone. The power dynamic shifted in an instant. Dan walked away. Nick Martin, he wouldn't be walking for long, because 2 weeks later, Nick Martin was dead. A sniper's bullet, a long-range shot, fired from the shadows while he watched a drag race with his family at the Perth Motorplex. A professional hit.
Range while watching drag races with his family at the
Dayne Brajkovich was never charged, never officially linked, but no one believed in coincidences, not in this world. And now with Dan barely surviving a knife to the throat, some people were wondering, was this attack payback for Nick Martin? Or was this just the start of something much bigger? If Dayne Brajkovich was trying to stay out of trouble, he had a funny way of showing it. Because while police were investigating who tried to kill him, they were also looking into something else. His money. It turned out that Brajkovich had been spending a lot of it. Not just on gold chains and designer clothes, but on something that raised even bigger red flags. Gold bars from the Perth Mint. The problem? The Perth Mint was already under fire for weak financial oversight. And now, a former Hells Angels enforcer was showing up with stacks of cash, buying hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of gold. That didn't just catch the attention of the police. That caught the attention of financial crime investigators. Where was the money coming from? Was it clean? Or was Brajkovich still doing business in the shadows? One thing was for sure. The cops weren't letting this go. And if they couldn't put him in a cell for gang-related violence, they'd get him for something else. Because if there's one thing bikers, gangsters, and the police all agree on, it's this. Money always tells the real story. What do you think? Is Dayne Brajkovich truly out of the game? Or is he just waiting for the next war to begin? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Like, share, and subscribe, because the outlaw world never sleeps. And neither should you.